So it's been a hot minute since I did a challenge video. It's not that I don't want to do more, but as I mention in every one of them, I want to find challenges that are interesting, not necessarily brutally difficult. Those can be harder to come up with than one would think, because it's not uncommon to come up with an idea that sounds great in a vacuum, only to test it and realize that the gameplay, and therefore the video itself, are extremely boring and repetitive, or so difficult that it's not interesting for me to suffer through. However, not long after Final Fantasy VII Rebirth released, I got a comment on my original Final Fantasy VII No Random Encounters video suggesting I should try the same thing here. Obviously, Rebirth doesn't have random encounters really, and this was actually a concept I'd rolled around in my head for Remake a bit, before realizing the linearity of it more or less forced you to interface with almost every battle. You can run from battles, which I certainly plan on trying, but on the face of it, constantly trying to run from battles also sounds kind of unfun to do or watch. In Rebirth though, most battles are in the open world, and what's more, the encounter system is more nuanced, meaning you can also find clever ways to avoid battle with well-timed and planned movements. So I figured I'd try it in Rebirth first. If you like this video, let me know and I'll see what I can do about doing a remake version as well. This challenge is another one that doesn't really have many rules, thankfully. Firstly, no doing any battles that aren't forced on you, obviously. You're allowed to enter a battle and run if possible, but you have to make sure your characters don't earn any AP or experience from an enemy being defeated. Doubly so since collecting AP and EXP are permanent, meaning clicking retry won't get rid of it. You'll have to go back to your last save instead. Secondly, and this is a rule that you can get rid of if you try this run yourself, I'm choosing not to do any side quests or go out of my way to grab tons of treasure out in the open world. There are indeed side quests that don't require fighting any battles. These quests can offer you great rewards and a fair amount of experience if you know which ones can be done without combat. Similarly, there are tons of goodies and treasure chests, and every bit can help if you're struggling. But for me personally, I wanted to try and do as much as I could while blazing through the straightest, simplest path I could to the end. How hard would it get if you do the bare minimum without any major exploits or skips that might have been found by the time this video releases? And finally, I'm doing this on a fresh file on normal difficulty. While you could do the whole challenge on normal and then do the same thing on hard with that same limited inventory of materia and everything, the AP and EXP you get on hard is so ramped up that you'll almost certainly end up with a party that's only marginally worse than you'd otherwise have very quickly, so hard is kind of a no-go. Why didn't I choose the dynamic difficulty option, you may ask? Well, the reason is pretty simple. Firstly, at the time, I still couldn't get confirmation on whether or not dynamic also leveled enemies down if your party was weak, and I didn't want to risk the game doing that. It doesn't. But a large reason for that worry was that obviously our party is always going to be underleveled, which also means the game is never going to be making enemies stronger in order to meet our power. Therefore, picking dynamic would play identically to normal the whole way through. With all that said, I actually had to do this challenge twice, which is part of why it took so long. I initially did testing on normal and got completely wrecked on Midgardsormr, the first boss. I survived, but with all my items consumed and an intense fear of what lay ahead. I restarted on easy just to test that, and it felt way more balanced. So I officially switched to easy, which saw the balance of that battle and the next few bosses feel solidly engaging. Unfortunately, it wasn't long until that got rather easy. The difficulty does eventually ratchet back up, but it does get pretty easy for most of the game. I was therefore originally going to make this video purely about how few battles were required, rather than the experience as a whole. But once I finished on easy, I decided to try Midgardsormr on normal one more time, and he was much more manageable now that I was warmed up, so to speak. So, in between a small vacation, other responsibilities, and getting extremely sick for a month, I redid the entire thing on normal. I haven't decided as I'm writing this script, but I might still use some footage from that easy playthrough, if it looks cleaner. But only for areas that involve skipping enemies, not bosses or required fights. Those I'll use the normal footage on, along with any strategic descriptions I might have for how to tackle them. With that all out of the way, while I won't really be talking about the story here, spoilers for all of Rebirth anyway. If you're good with that, let's get started. So, we begin our journey as Zack in Sector 5. We rush through a building and end up meeting some Shinra soldiers that we have to dispatch. I'll count this as 2 encounters since there's technically a cutscene breaking up one set of soldiers from another. Shortly after that, we find ourselves in the Nibelheim flashback, which has several encounters we can't avoid. The first is against the Disgorgon as Sephiroth. If we rush through Nibelheim itself, we're also forced to take part in the first tutorial fight, which is thrust upon us through a cutscene. You might think we can simply run by the next battle, which tutorializes the enemy awareness meter. There's a wide area around the enemies, and you can get beyond them without the meter maxing out. Unfortunately, this is one of a handful of fights in the game where once you reach a specific point on the map, there seems to be a trigger that automatically fills the meter and starts the fight. The next 2 fights are also tutorial battles, so it's unsurprising that the first forces you into combat through a cutscene, and the second can't be run past. This time, the meter instantly maxes out before you even get up to the enemies though. Thankfully, we can skip combat for a short while, up until we take the elevator to an interior section, which has a new, more complex enemy to force upon us. It goes down quickly considering this flashback is balanced in isolation from the rest of the game, and so we can move on equally as quickly. We have a short walk from here to the next major cutscene segment, at which point Sephiroth joins our battle team, and we're expected to fight another tutorial battle. This battle will instantly max out the encounter meter again, so we can tutorialize playing as Sephiroth. This is simple thanks to how powerful he is. Once we get past the naturally formed materia cutscene, before which there is a battle or 2 you can run past without engaging them, we find a battle that's difficult to run past thanks to a flying enemy above and a slow enemy below that tend to spread across the entire area. However, if the configuration is set up right and you go quickly, you can get the fleeing message to show up around the cliffside ahead. The game won't let you climb it while in battle, which is an issue that will come up a few more times in various contexts. But if you're a bit lucky, you'll flee before enemies get too close, and this will let you carry on without defeating any enemies. The next battle ahead seems like one that's difficult to run past. If you try to, you'll be hitting retry quite a bit while you hope the enemies spawn in advantageous positions. Unfortunately, this is another one where once you reach a certain point, battle automatically starts. Couldn't tell you why that's the case here, but the flashback does seem to have the highest concentration of battles like this by far. Climb a ledge and there's another battle waiting for you shortly afterward, which can't be escaped purely because of the tightly locked in arena you find yourself in. After this, we have what I'd consider a mini-boss fight with a zoo, and then more story stuff and exploring battle-free until we eventually are faced with the boss of the flashback, the Materia Guardian. Since, as I said before, the Nibelheim flashback has a set balance for us, I won't go into how to beat this boss, as if it's necessary anyway when Sephiroth is with us. With the prologue section of the game done, and our party finally within our control, we don't actually have any battles to do for a long while. In fact, the only battle you have to actually do within this entire chapter in Kalm and the surrounding area is the one with the Midgard-Zormr. Can you see why he might come across as a particularly tall roadblock when first experimenting with this challenge? You get no opportunities to earn EXP before this battle. There are some things you have to do first. Run from Shinra as they invade Kalm, grab a chocobo to help you cross the marsh, prove you can ride it well enough, and then there's a new weapon that you can just barely grab without engaging in violence, if the enemies aren't too close by. This actually illustrates something which is very useful in a multitude of places, which is that the encounter ring doesn't fill when you're interacting with things like chests, and it will briefly pause after you've finished as well, giving you a bit of a head start to scamper away. One note before we start the boss, it's best if you try to save your healing items for most of the game. We'll want to have a surplus all the way at the end. It's not that you shouldn't use items at all, of course, but particularly with Mega Potions and Giga Potions, the more we have during the final boss gauntlet, the better. Now, despite saying that the Midgard-Zormr is a rude awakening if you were expecting a walk in the park, strategy against him is highly limited, especially if you're not going out of your way to get whatever pacifist loot you can get away with. You won't have much at your disposal, other than some summon materia, a few abilities, and your good old block and parry. That's part of what makes this such a difficult fight, is that it's a mind game and a test to see if you recognize just how useful your fundamental battle mechanics are. What's more, when preparing for this battle, you'll likely realize that you often have to choose which weapon has the best ability for the upcoming boss. Sure, you just picked up a gun for Barret, but you have no battles you can use to max out his starting ability, so which will be more important here, focused shot or bonus round? And when will you get an opportunity to level them up to learn them permanently? You'd better make sure you use those opportunities to their fullest because they're finite. Just be careful rather than greedy, use Shiva for free ice damage, and you'll find this battle to be manageable before long, even if it takes you a few tries. From here we enter the Mithril Mine, which you might be surprised to hear, requires exactly no combat encounters outside of the 2 boss battles. Yes, really. Given how things went in the flashback chapter, you'd think any more tightly packed linear dungeon sections of the game would be rife with battles you can't make your way past, but that often couldn't be further from the truth. On the one hand, it's exhilarating to barely sneak past encounter after encounter like your Solid Snake with the sneaking suit on. On the other hand, it is kind of terrifying to be running past all that EXP and AP at the same time. Most battles here require you to simply run by, or maybe be a bit careful as you move past. Some ask you to very swiftly interact with objects so that you're immune to encounters. One in particular requires you to enter the combat area so that Aerith will start talking to you. You can then back just outside of the combat area until she pulls a lever and opens a gate for you, at which point you can sprint past. The Turks are our first boss fight here, specifically Rude and Elena. If you've finished Rebirth already, which I hope you have, otherwise why are you making this challenge your first playthrough? And especially if you've done hard mode, you shouldn't find this battle terribly challenging. Each member of the Turks relies on a gimmick of sorts. While these gimmicks can gel well with the gimmicks of their other allies in any given Turks fight, as long as you focus one down and manage their quirk effectively, this battle will be even easier than the Midgard-Zormr. Not easy, but easier. We're not yet at any severe level deficit, so we aren't that underpowered right now anyway. The battle after this with the Mithril Golem is similarly balanced around a party that might be this weak, so we're more than capable of handling it as well. The strategy here is therefore pretty standard as well. Bonus round on the head works wonderfully, at which point the boss staggers. When other parts of the golem become targets, you can target those if you feel you need to. Stardust Ray is also a pretty solid option, though it takes a bit of work to get the ATB necessary to use it. If Barret is in trouble, you'll often find he ends up your central combat pillar in this challenge. Red's great dodges and ability to build ATB quickly can help get him out of said trouble. As such, this battle is pretty standard too. Next up, Junon. Since we have no real choice, we can skip straight to Under Junon, where we almost immediately face another boss, Terror of the Deep. My default party for whenever it's not chosen for me is Cloud, Tifa, and Barret, and in this case, Barret and Tifa will really be your bread and butter combination. Tifa is phenomenal at avoiding the water cells the Terror shoots out, and if you emphasize using Unbridled Strength, you can really dish out the damage with her and Cloud when the boss is staggered. Until that point, Barret is the foundation, since the boss flies around so much, especially early on. While his dodge is awful for avoiding water cells, he can build up stagger really well with a combination of overcharge, bonus round pokes, and focused shots. Barret can also stay far enough away from the boss that while he will be the primary target whenever you're playing as him, long-range water jet attacks and such will be easy to avoid even with Barret's weak dodge. Since the only summons we'll ever have, because all the others require a battle, are Chocobo and Moogle, Ifrit, and Shiva, we don't actually have anything that's particularly strong against the Terror. You could technically get a few more summon options through pre-order bonuses and such, which will include Rama, Magic Pot, Moogle Trio, and Leviathan. Rama would therefore be optimal here, technically, but I chose not to use these options here since not everyone will have access to them. Still, it's worth summoning something when the option comes up, pretty much no matter what. Cloud, meanwhile, is good for emergency healing and pokes with his post-dodge airblades, but realistically you want to try and save his ATB gauges for healing and dealing damage when the terror is staggered. Thunder is obviously good if you have spare MP, and if you have Synchro Cyclone with Cloud and Tifa, the 0 MP cost buff can do wonders for getting everyone back into shape or surrounding the terror in a lightning hellscape. Finally, if you're low on MP and someone is in a water cell, because magic does the most damage to these little cages by far, you can expend Tifa's unbridled strength ability to really melt through it. Play smart and parry well, and this isn't much harder or different than it would be normally. At this point, there are no fights until you leave Upper Junon. Cloud gains access to a set of Shinra grunts, and you have to fight through a gauntlet of other Shinra soldiers to get to a boat. None of these fights are too difficult, but all 5 of them are required. Next up is a boss fight with Roche, who can really keep you on the back foot if you're reckless. But if you parry him at the right times, use Firebolt Blade or some other fire-based option, and make sure you keep Cloud healthy, he's a rewardingly fun fight to dominate. On to the Shinra 8 ship, the first half of which is a Queen's Blood championship, but you can actually immediately join the competition and then forfeit to skip it. You can even skip the match against Red by giving up. Shortly afterward, a bunch of enemies show up. There's a forced battle at the very start, at the front of the ship, thanks to a cutscene, which will happen several more times over the next 10 minutes. There's another fight before you go below deck, and one more when you first get down there, where Tifa joins you. Rest, check the shop, and do whatever else you need to do before heading further inside the ship for another fight, and then one more right after that. None of these are too noteworthy, other than that they're completely unavoidable. The next fight seems like it's going to be a moment where you can avoid confrontation, but it's another one of those rare moments where the encounter meter will always instantly fill around the time you get to the other side of the arena, moments before escaping up the tiny stairs. Some traversal and treasure later, you'll end up in one more forced fight thanks to a cutscene, and then it's on to the boss, Jenova Emergent. I expected this fight to be the hardest one yet, but while there absolutely can be close calls, she pressures pretty easily, allowing a smartly aggressive party to make strong progress consistently. Abuse the focus attacks and bonus round, especially during the first portion of the battle before Jenova drops down and can move. Staying far back with the Barret means you're pretty unlikely to even get hit. Once she drops to the ground, a more balanced party dynamic is rather fruitful. Several of Jenova's attacks here emphasize chip damage over a moderate area, and her harder hitting attacks are fairly easy to dodge with Cloud or Tifa, so keep Jenova confused and overwhelmed by bouncing back and forth. If you end up on Barret and she seems distracted for longer than usual, take advantage. Even if he ends up taking a hit because you get greedy, he's sturdy enough to not be melted too easily. The Corel area is probably one of the longer ones, since it includes the section around Costa del Sol, Mount Corel, the Gold Saucer, and the Corel Desert. As such, it includes 5 bosses, but surprisingly, there are only 4.5 normal fights mixed in with that. Why 4.5? We'll get to that. So first up is some minigames and things in Costa del Sol to get beach attire. Once that's accomplished, it's time for a short battle that transitions into another boss called the Gastropod. We'll count these separately as a fight and a boss. Gastropod has pretty easy parries, and some AoE options that can catch an unsuspecting player off guard. But if you're on your game, these aren't very difficult to handle even though our level is struggling to keep up, and our materia is now officially falling behind. That's because the fight is designed to be survivable as your party members get captured, until it's only Cloud left. There isn't much to say here because of that. Fight it like you normally would, and don't get greedy. Once again, it's a while before we have another fight. All the way through the Costa del Sol area we go, and we start climbing up Mount Corel. Here we're stuck with Cloud, Red, and Aerith, but that also means the challenges are designed with this configuration in mind, which is something the game is generally excellent at doing during forced parties. Luckily, we're skipping all but one of those challenges until we get to their boss. There's only one battle here that can't be skipped by giving it a wide berth, running past it and then using the flee function, or jumping jumping across rocks, which will also pause the encounter meter with each hop, just like opening a chest. This battle is in a tight cave with a handful of worms. Yes, really. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find rock hops or enemy spawns that allowed me to skip this battle. I don't think it's technically impossible to get past. I just think it's one of the only cases where there isn't a big enough hole to slip through to make it happen. At least without exploits I'm not privy to. This is basically one of the only battles that is a question mark for me without major exploits or glitches. So if you figured out a way through it organically, leave it in the comments. Custom Valkyrie is next, and the most obnoxious parts of this battle in a normal run still hold true. It spends most of its time in the air, and so it often rises or moves quickly in ways that leave it out of the reach of Cloud and Red. That, and the residual fire it leaves on the ground is likely going to be the biggest threat, because it can end up everywhere and be very difficult to avoid when concentrating on other things. A fair amount of this boss's attacks can't be parried, so relying on well-timed dodges is going to be important. As soon as you can, get Aerith to conjure a ward for herself so she has some way to get around the fire if she ends up stuck in a corner or whatever. Arcane Ward is also useful for casting spells the boss is weak to, since it doubles the cast. Though, just be careful about your MP levels if you're also using Aerith as a healer. Unfortunately, since I wasn't using Aerith in free party configurations, she didn't yet have Arcane Ward or Radiant Ward learned, so I had to choose between them. Radiant Ward is much better for building ATB, dodging, and putting down magic damage, so if you're in the same situation, it's up to you which you think will be more fruitful. And if you don't use Aerith regularly then, whenever safe, spam it so you can permanently learn it for upcoming fights that require Aerith. Other than that, focus thrust with Cloud, poke a lot with Red, and try to use options like Fireworks Blade when safe. That last bit is important because synergy abilities don't come with immunity, and this boss is one that can particularly punish poor use of them. As long as you can get that first hit off, you're good, but if you miss with Fireworks Blade's particularly long windup, it's likely not gonna end well. And with the lower HP amounts we have and the fact that we're still only capable of casting Cure with lower magic attack values instead of Cura with a more competent party, one major mistake can cause a snowball effect. I would argue this is probably the toughest boss so far. Thankfully, we get a bit of a combat break from here. Despite how tight the caves and the mountains can be, we don't actually have another forced fight until the first terminal we have to activate is Yuffie, to get the elevator to move for Barret and Tifa. This is another battle where the gauge fills as soon as you hit an invisible trigger near the terminal. The next battle is with a bomb at the other terminal right before the boss. And once again, there's a trigger that activates the battle automatically. Still, even with a weaker, completely unplayed Yuffie, she's so capable that this battle is easy. Gigatrice is up now, and with this party combination, it doesn't stand much of a chance. It's almost not even worth discussing, since the specific combination of abilities offered here is so strong that the battle plays out basically like it normally would, except with a bit more risk involved. The biggest universal difference really will come down to how paltry your materia growth will currently be, and I suppose if you don't use Tifa and Barret, this battle might be quite a bit more difficult without access to all of their current abilities. Still, I feel like with a particularly skilled player, even Yuffie solo could handle this as she was when she first joined the party. That's how powerful she is in the right hands. After this boss, and after visiting Corel proper, it's off to the Gold Saucer. Right away we have a fight with Dio, if you're pedantic enough to count that as a battle. Then more shenanigans until we end up being expected to partake in the battle square. So I initially counted this as a forced battle, since technically you are forced to partake. On my easy mode playthrough, I even finished it. It was only like an hour later, when it was too late to go back, that I realized you might be able to intentionally lose and still progress. Turns out, you can do exactly that, meaning while entering the battle is forced, gaining anything from it is not. This is a more serious example of a battle where it's kind of up to you if you count it as a required fight. I do not, because it's really no different from the battles where you're kind of forced to enter and then use the flee mechanic to escape. If you have any reasoning to the contrary, feel free to put it below in the comments. After this, we only have 2 more bosses before we get to Gongaga. If you play your cards right in the Corel prison area, you can avoid all of the side quests that require combat, and still just barely get Pico healthy enough to race. Yes, these side quests give you EXP and such no matter what, which I said I was going to try to avoid, but considering a minimum amount of these quests is required to progress, I don't count any of them as actual side quests unless Pico is already healthy. Next up is the fight with Dyne. Similar to Gastropod or Roche, this fight is designed to be fought with a single character, which means it already has a very limited, static party configuration in mind, so it's basically just a mildly more difficult version of what you've already seen in a normal playthrough. Palmer's Anuran suppressor mech will cap off the Corel region in a pretty unsurprising fashion. It was at this point that I realized most bosses were likely to be fairly standard, especially whenever a required party setup is enforced. That doesn't mean they aren't more difficult, and as I've stressed before, having to choose between which weapon has an ability you think you'll need and having poorly grown materia both increase the challenge noticeably further. Another difficulty is finding meaningful times to spam abilities you do want characters to learn, and in particular getting the proficiency bonuses, but Rebirth was so well balanced overall that these battles always still feel doable. Anuran Suppressor hits like a truck, can be unpredictable in terms of how often he makes his hitboxes fly all over the place, and has solid defenses. But if you've played the game on normal or above, you fought this fight before. Next up is Gongaga. As with all of the open world areas, we don't have to worry about battles until the story actually gets underway. We leave Gongaga proper with Cloud, Barret, Red, and Katesith as a backup member, and make our way to the ruined reactor. There's one weird quirk in this area that's similar to something you'd run across in the No Random Encounters challenge for the original FF7, so I figured I'd warn you about it here. Make sure you have at least 1,000 gil when you get to the end of the chapter. It's very unlikely you won't, but remember that we have no real ways to get more outside of selling stuff. If you don't have 1,000 gil, you can't ride with Sid to the Cosmo Canyon area, so try to be the least bit frugal here and you'll be okay. There are a handful of battles in this chapter that seem pretty difficult to avoid at first glance, but if you wait for the right moment and exploit things like jumps to other areas or object interactions, then more battles can be avoided than you might expect. Overall, this area has a higher density of forced battles than we've experienced in a while, but they're spread between our initial visit as Cloud's party and the secondary visit with Tifa's. The first of these battles actually comes fairly early in this first visit. As far as I could find, you have to climb up on this specific area of ground and be ambushed by little Froggo bros, but they're easy to handle, so on we go. As an interesting aside, I actually found a glitch here which allows you to hang out with Sephiroth. You see, if you enter this battle with these 2 Grand Horns and then move to a certain part of the arena before you retry, there's a pretty substantial chance that you'll respawn on the walkway above instead of where you first entered battle range. This allows you to skip the trigger that shows Sephiroth walking through a doorway with some whispers around him, and raise the water level first. If you do this, you can simply swim across and the whispers at the doorway will just stay there, idle. Go a bit further and you'll find a door to your right, where the developers stored Sephiroth's model for the cutscene, meaning you can take pictures with him if you want. At first, I thought this was a soft lock that could permanently brick your file if you saved in this situation and then overwrote your autosaves. Continuing further ahead is impossible because none of the other triggers for story events spawn until you've witnessed that Sephiroth scene. And for some reason, the first time I accidentally made this glitch occur, going to the area where the cutscene trigger is supposed to be did nothing. But every time I've done it since then, the trigger was still there, meaning as long as you're not super foolish and unlucky with this glitch at the same time, it should be safe to play around with. And after you've beat the game, you can just chapter select anyway. Not long after this area is a place to rest, and then 2 easy mob battles we have to do before the boss, Specimen H1024. Once again, a fairly standard boss fight, except with fewer options, and he hits like a truck. Katesith can thankfully dish it out as well, and is great for punishing when the boss is pressured or staggered. By now you should hopefully have at least 1 materia with Cura for those huge emergencies. Barret can stay safe and build stagger effectively, and Cloud serves as an all-around fighter that is a particularly great distraction here. Once that's done, it's time for Tifa, Aerith, and Yuffie to head to the same place to help. They go along a different path and primarily fight Shinra soldiers. The first fight is right outside the reactor. There's no way to scale around these soldiers, which is lucky because they're a fantastic opportunity to permanently earn a few abilities. From here, it's not until we get into a fairly large new area where another battle occurs. This is another one like the Worm Cave on Mount Corel, where it's technically avoidable as far as I can tell, but because it's with several frogs on such a small walkway, I couldn't find any enemy positions and pathway through that wouldn't trigger a battle. Exploits seem to be the only way it could be possible. As soon as you escape into the open air beyond this room, there's another mandatory fight with more Shinra grunts. This battle is more dangerous than the earlier one, but is still a phenomenal way to catch up on earning abilities from weapons, so make use of it. From here, every battle is optional until we get to the next boss, Crimson Mare Mark II. I'm a broken record over here, but say it with me. This battle is pretty standard, so there isn't much to say. Our party members aren't as bulky as the other party is, so this battle can feel more intense overall, but hopefully Aerith has Radiant Ward at this point, so she can be fast and hit hard too. Combined with Yuffie's dominating versatility and Tifa's ability to build good stagger before hitting like a freight train in 10 times gravity, as long as you keep this party alive, they're more than capable. Yuffie I've found is the best at destroying the arms, with abilities like Art of War if timed intelligently, and Windstorm. This will significantly improve survivability for a while before Scarlet gets new ones. Using the right element for ranged attacks, and using Doppelganger if you have access to it, just adds to the pain you can dish out. From here, this area is done, and it's time for Cosmo Canyon. Cosmo Canyon is about as short as Gongaga was, but this time there's going to be an initial emphasis on Red and Barret. Skip the open world battles, some of which here are actually a bit tight because they're on a cliffside. Then make your way through everything in the village proper until you get to the trials Bugenhagen decides Red is finally ready for. For these trials, the game chooses Red, obviously, and Barret to be your party. While that once again means the battles will be tailored to this smaller, less capable party, the boss of this section actually pulls less punches than you'd think. But before that, we've got a few normal fights we can't skip. The first is not long after we enter the dungeon. Despite this seeming like another area where we can easily skip past such small enemies in such a large dungeon, there's another trigger volume of some sort that instantly engages battle near the other end of the arena. It's simply impossible through normal means to get to the climbable wall surface without the battle starting. You can actually avoid combat from here though until you reach the large square room where you need to find the Gi statuette for the Gi spirit in the large statue in the center of the room. There's good loot in here, so grab everything else first. Then bring the statuette to Bugenhagen and the large Gi statue will come alive. Easy enough to bring down. Very shortly after this, there's a fight in a hallway that is way too narrow to not engage combat in. It seems like you could probably engage the fight and then flee from it, but because engaging the fight makes you drop the statuette, and you need the statuette, this fight becomes mandatory as far as I can tell. I couldn't get spawns that allowed me by peacefully, and since you can't hit retry when you're not in battle, there doesn't seem to be a way to move past the enemies and hit retry in a place where the statuette will respawn in a safe location past the encounter. Anyway, from here the required fights come every few minutes. You can still skip most encounters in this area, but it wants you to fight Gi enemies a few times along the way. The next one is after you've grabbed the Emerald Statuette, which is a scripted event that can't be escaped and requires you to fight with Red alone. Though even if you could flee from this fight, you still drop the statuette on the battlefield just like with the previous encounter. This fight can be dangerous, especially if you're trying to spam Red's abilities to learn them like I was, so don't get too greedy. Once you have all the statuettes and move forward, you'll find yourself in an open section with several encounters. All of these are optional if you pick your routes correctly and move carefully. It's when we open the gate at the end that we have another forced fight with the Gi. It's safe to assume the reason these fights are forced is because they introduce new Gi soldier types, and the game wants to make sure you know how to fight them. Either way, while the Gi really pack a punch and a half, Red and Barret together can make it through. Up ahead is probably one of the cheekiest encounters to avoid. There's a set of smaller enemies wandering around near a chain you have to pull in order to extend a bridge to continue. While it might seem fruitless, if you can get the spawns just right, you can run by and start pulling the chain. You'll be pulling it toward the enemies and almost certainly start an encounter with them eventually, which forces Red to drop the chain. However, when you hit retry, you'll notice that the chain doesn't reset. This means while it can be painfully obnoxious, especially right near the end, you can keep pulling the chain bit by bit before you enter the encounter until the bridge is fully extended. It can actually help give you a bit more time if the enemies are turned away, so they don't always have to simply be far away to get some time to pull the chain. Then once the bridge is complete, you just need to get a decent spawn and run straight past the enemies. No more battles are required from here until you get the second gate open, at which point another gang of Gi will attack. This is the most difficult of the lot, but it's also the last one before the boss, Gongaga. Gongaga is probably one of the most demanding bosses of this challenge, but as with most of the bosses before now, if you just play like you would in a normal playthrough, but a bit more carefully, you'll be fine. He packs a punch, and the doom section at the end is even more anxiety-inducing than it is normally, but because you only have Red and Barret, the ability option deficit you normally feel in this challenge is partially accounted for already by the game. Take the boss down, and after a few cutscenes and such, you'll end up with a full party again. This section where you learn about the Gi and their desperate wishes is linear, and all 3 fights with Gi soldiers are required. The last one in particular is one of the most challenging normal mob fights that's required by the game, thanks to the Gi soldiers that will revive their allies and excel at dodging attacks in the meantime. But if you can succeed in taking one out with ATB abilities that are difficult to dodge, and then wait for the second one to start the revival process, he won't be able to dodge while doing so. It might take a bit of back and forth if he barely gets the revival off, but once one is down, the other will always prioritize reviving them, so it's only a matter of time before they're both down and it becomes a more standardized fight again. And with that, Cosmo Canyon is done, and it's off to the final open world area of the game, the Nibelheim area. Nibelheim, unsurprisingly, doesn't work any differently from the previous areas. Skip past the open world and head straight to the town. Then, once in town, feel free to basically skip through everything there. Once you get your party for the reactor excursion, skip everything until you get to the boss, Diabolic Variant. Yes, really, while there are plenty of battles on the way to this boss, not a single one is required. Even though the configuration seems more difficult to flee from, since it's 2 flying enemies this time, you can even run past the group near the short cliff that blocks you after passing the naturally formed materia. Likewise, the enemies right after that are avoidable this time, instead of instantly maxing out the encounter meter as they did before. Since the previous path after that is broken, the developer saw fit to not ambush you on the cliffside either. Even once we get into new areas, battles are largely either easily avoidable, or you can use flee to get past. One interesting thing is the dragon in a circular arena guarding a small cave. This gives all the hallmark signals that it's going to be a battle that instantly fills the meter at some point. It feels like a mini-boss encounter, honestly, but if you just stick down below on the left side while hugging the wall, he'll let you right through for some reason. The boss of this section can be difficult if you let him get too far ahead of you in terms of pace, to the point that I actually got a game over once. Despite our extremely strong party configuration, since it's a required configuration, he's built to bully and annoy us with poisons, teleports, doppelgangers, all in the name of whittling us down while he keeps himself just out of arm's reach. When I was playing on easy, he only ever posed a threat once he started cloning himself. On normal, after the first game over, he didn't even really get the chance to do so. You see, I got extremely lucky with a stagger, which happened right as the boss was about to do his scripted move, where he covers the entire area in poison, called In Shadow. With a weaker party like this, that would effectively put us on a moderately difficult timer, since it would be hard to heal through, and at that point he'd start duplicating himself. But because I staggered him while he was preparing the attack, It cancelled the phase entirely. See, a normal game party is likely going to run across this phase change far before a stagger is available, because it happens when just 1/3 of the boss's health is gone. And on my first normal attempt here, it was the reverse. My attack choices were so stagger focused instead of balancing it with damage that I staggered him before he was at low enough health to even start the phase change. That's how it happened on easy too. If you do this, he won't enter the phase change until after the stagger ends, but crucially, he has a damage blocker that stops your progress once 2/3 of his health is gone, so that when he recovers, he can do the phase change. These factors combined basically guarantees the phase change for most strategies. However, on my second attempt on normal, I more effectively balanced stagger building and damage at the same time. This meant that by sheer luck, he started the In Shadow attack and phase change right before I staggered him. Because that happened, the game assumed he'd already used In Shadow successfully, so it removes the damage blocker and he won't try to use In Shadow again, nor duplicate himself. And because Diabolic Variant has a lower health pool, or else weaker defenses, one of the two, so that he's not torturously annoying to chip away at when he starts duplicating himself, fighting his first phase version the entire time means you're kind of just fighting a wet paper bag compared to some of the other bosses. With that boss down, we switch to another party of Barret, Katesith, and Aerith, with Katesith in charge. They quickly fall for a trap, and now it's our job to make our way through the labs under the Shinra Mansion. This basically consists of a bunch of rooms that use Katesith's Moogle doll to solve puzzles, with enemy encounters in most rooms. A fair amount of these are mandatory, but a fair amount can also be skipped. Immediately, we're forced to do an easy battle in order to complete the puzzle in this room. It's nothing special. A short while later, we have an unavoidable fight in a room where we have to put a cart under a box dropping hole so the box doesn't fall so far it breaks. But this room is small enough that the encounter is effectively required. The same can be said for the room with the Mako boxes you have to throw in the spinning funnel. You might think you can skip the encounter with a bunch of bats in the next room, but for some reason the elevator isn't interactive until they're dealt with. From here we can skip some more combat and climb through some color-coded ducts for a while, until the room where we have to throw boxes onto an elevator to weigh it down. These two enemies themed as scales are simply too fast and aggressive, and I could never get the slow Moogle doll to safety up where the elevator is without entering combat. It might be possible in hindsight to throw the boxes up there, then switch to Katesith to sprint up there, and then switch back to the doll to throw them on the elevator, but even that would be rather difficult because just the time it takes to get on the Moogle and grab a box is seemingly always too slow and will get you caught. Another one that if you test it out and figure out it's doable, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Once that's dealt with, we have 4 bosses back to back. Yin and Yang is quite a bit harder than normal, but if you've been spamming Katesith abilities to learn them permanently throughout this dungeon, and especially if you get lucky with Yin and Yang's initial behaviors, it's still a very standard fight. Forgotten Specimen is in contention as the most difficult boss up to this point, because his later phase really punishes mistakes and poor party spacing around the arena. Placing a Radiant ward on top of an ATB ward is a critically strong combination here, and whenever you use Aerith in the future. If you can keep yourself safe long enough, repeated uses of Katesith's Moogle magic to conjure a summon can be very useful, and Barret's usual combination of Steel Skin, Bonus Round, Overcharge, and Focus Shot is strong as heck here. And since Forgotten Specimen leaps around the arena so often and does AoE attacks, simply parrying with Barret instead of trying to dodge anything or switch boss aggro can be an effective choice. This will likely be a longer battle, but it's more than possible. Up next is what might arguably be the most difficult battle in the entire run, period. I can only think of one that I might argue is more difficult, but that's only because it's so long and has so many phases. Vincent's Galleon Beast transformation is quick, hits extremely fast and hard, leaps around the arena, has a brutal phase change upgrade, has good ranged attacks, There isn't much weakness to this guy, which I suppose is what you want to do if you're trying to get players excited for playing as him in the next game, but with a weak party like ours, he's genuinely scary, and I think I died on him the most in my normal difficulty playthrough of this challenge. Granted, that was only 2 or 3 times, but it was still frightening because whatever you have here is what you're stuck with, and your party is chosen for you, despite Kasith being a bit of a strange pick here. The funny thing is that I also don't think I have a ton to say about this boss in spite of that increased difficulty, but that's because it was such chaos that I kind of just had to wing it. Kasith is good at punishing during stagger. Barret is solid as usual if you can keep the boss from instantly targeting him and mowing him down whenever you switch, and while Cloud can be effective, poor play with him will see him demolished because he's unsafe to use against an enemy like this. Galleon Beast also has a few fake out style tells that lure in bad play, which I wasn't particularly great at handling this time around. If you find that Kasith and Cloud are having a difficult time staying alive, using Lifesaver with Barret can alleviate some of that. Just watch his health because mistakes with those other party members will drain it fast. Even though it elongates the battle, also don't be afraid to use some stagger time to heal or prepare for faster staggers in the future, like re-upping on bonus round or steel skin. If I had to argue anything got me through this battle, it would be that, taking it slow and being willing to sacrifice some of the better damage dealing chances in order to prep for more punishment. The last part of this chapter is one more boss, Roche again. Since it's just Cloud against him once more, this battle is pretty standard. He still hurts quite a bit more than normal, and it took me a try or two, but once you get his punishes down, this battle is easy to control, and once you catch a good wind, he falls apart in around a minute. Up next is the final 2 sections before we get to Boss Gauntlet City. A return to the Gold Saucer, and our long and arduous trek through the Temple of the Ancients, which ends up not being near as long and arduous as you might think. There are quirks to it, but it plays nicer with a challenge like this than one would assume. But first, the Gold Saucer awaits. While the second visit to this massive theme park we all know and love takes a hot minute to get through, there isn't actually too much combat here. We only have battles in the battle square. This time we unfortunately can't intentionally lose or give up to get through though. There are 3 standard battles followed by 3 back-to-back bosses, and party configurations for all of these battles are selected for us. The first normal battle is arguably the most difficult of the 3, since it kind of just fills the arena with a bunch of Don Corneo's thugs, but it's also the most unremarkable of the 3. The second battle is the one I'd say is the easiest, by contrast. A bunch of Corneo-inspired cactuars spin around the arena so fast you can't even see them. Every once in a while, one will stop to attack. If you're being attentive, you should be able to put the hammer down on it before it can do much. Do that a few times, and you're done. The third battle is dangerous if you're not keeping ready on your dodges, since it's with a handful of Toneberries, and yet another Corneo-inspired, larger one, the Dawnberry. Stay away from the instant kills though, and don't get too aggressive while on Kasith's Moogle or with Barret because their dodges are weaker, and you'll get through it. After this is the first boss, with who else but the Dawn himself, on top of his pet from the first game, Abzu. Without water and a bunch of babies to boss around, Abzu's moveset is decently remixed here. There's a much higher emphasis on physical attacks. Thankfully, that means it's actually quite a bit easier to prevent damage, especially with the parry, and it's easier to punish as well. It's pretty simple to pressure Abzu and build stagger here, so I don't think there's much else that needs saying beyond this. The same can largely be said for this next battle, which is with the Turks again. Your party configuration changes to Cloud, Tifa, and Aerith here, but that's fine because the battle is with Rude and Elena again, which means it's the same matchup it was way back in the Mithril Mines. While this battle is technically tougher with bigger numbers, and the level deficit is more serious, we also have many more ability options than we did before. ATB Ward stacked on top of Radiant Ward, properly exploiting the gimmicks of both enemies, focused thrusts, you know the deal here. Rinse, repeat. The final boss is Rufus, who we haven't fought since the end of Remake, so it might be a bit difficult to remember how to exploit his attacks. Once again, it's a fight with only Cloud, and the condition he was in at the end of the last battle carries over to this one, so be aware of that. This is yet another battle that's designed to work with such a limited party, so if you can get on board with Rufus's gimmicks, you'll handle this battle without too much fuss. It might take a few tries though if you're not used to him, because he counters and decimates decimates anyone who's greedy or not paying attention. Try to keep regen up at all times. No, I'm not saying regen. And having haste is also really useful. Put simply, the main gimmick here is that you want to avoid Rufus's attacks so that you don't take damage and have slow recovery times. Then you want to go on the offensive the moment you're safe. Rufus will always be pressured if you attack him right after he does, while he's recovering, or if you attack him during the reload ability. If you need to relearn this battle, then stay a decent distance away, learn his attacks and how to dodge them, and slowly inch closer until you're within range to punish. Eventually, he'll summon his cat dog to help. What I like doing to handle this is saving up my limit break. It should be all the way up or nearly so by the time his pet arrives. If you want to risk it, try to pressure and stagger it first. If you don't, just dump your limit on him. This should sever the tie temporarily, and you can then go ham with ATB abilities to delete Cat Dog's remaining HP. This is a particular area where having haste on helps quite a bit. Then you just go back to finishing off Rufus, and that's that. Now that Corneo and Shinra have been put in the trash where they belong, we only have one major dungeon to go before the end. Being so long, the Temple of the Ancients probably has the largest amount of forced battles, but it still ends up being far less than the total battles available. The first one, with an excess of Shinra grunts and 2C soldiers, is obviously going to be forced. The tougher units can absolutely wreck you if you let them, and sheer numbers can overwhelm. While I wouldn't call this a genuinely difficult battle per se, it's not the overpowered flex you'd find on a normal playthrough, where you decimate basically everything. Not far in the temple itself, you'll find another mandatory fight with a few more Shinra grunts that can't be avoided. From here, it's a decent while before we'll run across another fight. It's with, you guessed it, yeah, more Shinra. This time the battle is necessary because moving a massive block near them is the only way to progress. A couple of minutes after that, you'll run across another battle with a ridiculous amount of Shinra forces. This time though, they're all low tier, so even with this party you'll melt them, especially if you use triple slash to blaze around the arena and smack multiple dudes at once. Immediately after this is a place to rest, and then our first boss, Red Dragon. Red Dragon is another boss that punishes not being prepared for its various quirks, but if you are, well, it can still wreck you. You can keep momentum up enough to make the battle feel fairly normal. Use pillars against it when you can, focus on using Barret and parrying physical attacks instead of dodging, and then really try to emphasize weakening his giant AoE when he starts using that. Always kind of a tough fight, but also one that always has a clear path to victory. After this, the party gets split up, and we first join Cloud, Tifa, and Barret. Before too long, you'll find the areas with Mako wind gusts. The first section of this has a Shinra fight that's as unremarkable as it is unskippable. We then have a ways to go before another fight is necessary. It too is with Shinra guys in a small room. This happens one more time not too far after that, which then transitions us into the other party consisting of Aerith, Yuffie, and Red. Pretty quickly, we find ourselves in a forced encounter with this fresh party, mostly to tutorialize collecting life stream orbs with Aerith, which she can then use to conjure new areas of the temple to traverse. This is actually the only fight you have to do in this area, if you play your cards right. The goal is to get as much of the life stream power as possible and only use it on the most naturally lucrative and necessary parts of the map. So in this case, we want to skip the conjuration point to the right at the start, because if I remember correctly, the only thing it really gives us is a high ether and a dead end. Instead, unlock the opposite section, which is how we continue the level. If you collected all of the energy you could before now, you'll still have a decent supply in reserve. Once you get to the big open area with a bunch of places to leave your Mako juice, collect the residual juice from the last person to play this escape room puzzle, and then unlock the area straight to the east. You have to fill at least 2 of these 4 juice cups before the way forward unlocks. This eastern area has a decent amount of big chonker and little chonker orbs to refill you. Next, do the southwest area. This one has a fair amount of orbs too, and some battles you can run by to grab some sneaky treasures, my favorite of which being a maxed out steadfast block materia. This should leave you with a Mako juice meter that's about 3/4 full, which is more than enough to open the way forward. Head that way and you'll eventually regain control of Cloud. As soon as you start with this new old party, you'll enter a battle. It's not bad if you focus down the frogs first. After this, there are no more fights until we get to our next boss, Ironclad. If you've done post-game VR content, you've probably fought this dude a lot. Stay behind him, emphasize not getting hit, and slowly build up that stagger meter. He's basically harmless as long as you're careful, so carry on being careful. When that's done, we're free until we come face to face with the Turks again, our next boss. But first we have to help them dispatch some enemies in a forced encounter. Once that's done, we're free to duke it out with our rivals though. This time it's with Rude and one who's been out of commission this whole game, Reno. Reno is still pretty similar to his remake incarnations, meaning he's threatening and annoying, but he also has his own Turk gimmick weakness to exploit. So, exploit those weaknesses, namely dodge whenever he tries to counter you or counter with your own ATB abilities, and also be a bit careful due to the level deficit that is slowly closing up, and dominate. From here we move back to Aerith's party. Almost immediately there's a fight with a single flying enemy on a narrow bridge. This fight isn't difficult and you can throw everything at it because there's a place to rest right afterward. We're then put into an area that forces us to do 2 more battles. One is with a Hectize and a Floating Death, and the other is with 2 Hectize. With Yuffie as your main, these battles aren't particularly challenging. Focus down the Hectize first, make sure to avoid their HP leeching attempts, and use their elemental weakness with long-ranged shuriken spells and a doppelganger to stagger them fairly quickly. Then go in for the kill with an all-out assault, where Sorceress Storm will delete huge chunks of their health in an instant. The Floating Death, by contrast, isn't really even a threat. Now we just have another Turks fight, with 1 classic and 1 new fighter, Elena and Sang. Still works like every other Turks fight, and this might be the easiest one, because pressuring Sang is as simple as using Red or Yuffie to dodge his basic barrage with their excellent dodge skills, and Elena we already know how to handle. We're most of the way through the temple now, just a few more fights and then a boss to go. First we have to do some flashbacks, and then run around a bit until we get to a large, square room with just a Pantera protector and an ancient dragon inside. Easy avoid, right? Wrong. When we get to the door, the gauge instantly maxes out. Defeat these plebs and let's move on. From here, we can avoid combat in these large rooms in the way we'd originally hoped, grabbing some treasure and things along the way. The very next seemingly mandatory fight we find is with a giant turtle that I'm sure at least a few of you watching have been worried about at least since we entered the temple. Well, thankfully, this turtle is optional. Yup, even though some websites list it as a mini-boss monster, you can walk right by this big guy. It isn't long after him though when we do find another fight we do have to do though. We'll enter alternate reality hologram cutscene land, and as we walk past the theme park ride, there will be a couple of rooms that lock us down and force combat. This first one is with another Pantera protector and a Floating Death. Easy peasy. The next one is a nightmare we all knew was coming, a Pantera protector and the moss-grown Adamantoise again. He must have used a shortcut to get here before us because he's adamant that we test our mettle against him. First things first, crush the Pantera. We don't want rings of fire showing up in the middle of dodging turtle bombs. Once that's done, the turtle fight can go really badly, really well, or somewhere in between. But it's very easy for it to go badly. He shoots homing projectiles at an increasingly constant rate, which then leaves danger puddles under our feet that do pretty rapid damage. While Barrett is still our best for building stagger here, his slow dodge means it's very difficult to make use of that. Meanwhile, I can never seem to get to the turtle's blind spot when he's blocking in order to pressure him like you're supposed to. This is another battle where it was such chaos that it's hard to pinpoint exactly what I did, other than bounce regularly between characters, dodge a lot, and use the help of a summon. This was interestingly probably the easiest turtle fight I've had out of the 10 or so that I've fought, but it really did seem like pure luck where the right things lined up at the right time. That's despite the fact that effectively hitting its elemental weakness like you're told to do isn't particularly easy here because of our weaker spell selection. The fight started incredibly poorly, so poorly in fact that I died, but the second time the Pantera melted really quickly, and the momentum against the Adamantoise just grew from there. I summoned Ifrit, which lines up with the turtle's weakness, so provided some decent assistance. From there I mostly just poked at it with Tifa and Barrett, and used Unbridled Strength with Tifa twice, so I was prepared when the stagger came, and I used Cloud for group healing. At one point the enemy wedged himself face first into a wall, and we just kinda walloped him until we got lucky with Ifrit pressuring him. A quick focused thrust staggered him, and got Cloud's limit up, at the same time that Ifrit was just about to do Hellfire, so I started Cross Slash, switched to Tifa to unload Rise and Fall and Omni Strike, and then Hellfire went off to decimate the turtle. He wasn't quite dead, but he was still staggered, meaning with Tifa's ATB full again, I could Chi Trap, True Strike, and then smash him into oblivion. If I had one tip that I think helped here, and maybe in the other fight I was just kind of winging it on, the Galleon Beast, it would be to focus primarily on avoiding the need to heal often. Not having to scramble to save an ally really does make a difference for keeping on the offensive. With the true boss of the temple done, we have a victory lap boss, and one of my favorites, Demon Gate. Demon Gate is shockingly easy, considering the original version was one of the only bosses that was actually threatening in the PS1 game. Unleash Barret from afar, get Tifa's unbridled strength attacks ready, and when you want to give Barret a breather, you can use focus thrusts with Cloud. While a second Demon Gate shows up behind you before long, if you just focus down the one that was already there originally, you can pretty quickly make it a 3-on-1 again, instead of a 3-on-2. At that point, you already know you can beat the second Demon Gate because you already beat the first. Escape the temple, do cutscenes and stuff, during which we have an arguable battle with some whispers where there is no battle HUD, which you guys can debate in the comments whether it counts or not, and then we're off to the Forgotten Capital. This area has one mandatory fight with actual whispers that are pretty strong until you defeat at least one of them. In fact, I died twice here on my easy playthrough because I expected them to be cake and got caught off guard. After that, we have what the game considers 2 boss fights, and since the battle HUD is on the screen during all of the cutscenes, except for when you switch from fighting Jenova to fighting Sephiroth, that's how I'm going to count them, 2 fights. Just like with the no random encounters challenge I did with the original Final Fantasy VII, we're going to be about 10 levels below what the game expects of us, 45-ish instead of 55. That deficit has a bit of a bigger impact here than in the original game, but still isn't too big of an issue if you play smart. Going in, I have one piece of advice before you start. Level everything up and optimize gear the best you can, including putting your best healing materia and the magnify materia on Aerith. Then save, and then buy a bunch of Phoenix Downs and Mega/Giga Potions. Run your bank dry. We do this after we save so that if we fail and feel like different amounts of different items would be better, we can do that instead. We will absolutely want to primarily be using items to heal here, because they have no cast time, do a static amount no matter which character is using it, and every character can use the same items. Hopefully you've been stocking up, so don't be super reckless, but you can let loose. The Jenova fight is actually the more difficult one, partially because of the random elements involving which party members you get access to in specific parts. The first part is one of them. I got very lucky here because I got Tifa. You see, this first phase will put up a barrier that can only be destroyed with magic. We don't want to be wasting tons of MP or dealing with risky cast times. Other allies can be helpful here too, but getting Tifa is a good roll of the dice. So when the barrier comes up, Chi Trap comes out. This will take around a third of the barrier's health. Blade Burst also takes about a third of the barrier's health. If you can get the barrier down, Jenova will be pressured, so you can focused thrust your way to a stagger if you're quick. Then if you want, you can use the limit breaks of your party members to move to the next phase, or you can alternatively save them for later. This first phase can be incredibly annoying if the right pieces don't align, but since it's the first phase, resetting to get different party members wouldn't be the biggest time sink. Once Jenova has lost about a third of her health, the battle moves forward. The next phase is going to be harder or easier depending on your party. With Tifa and Red again, it was actually markedly easier than usual. Focus on stagger. If you have the need and opportunity, Red's Watcher's Respite is a great way to heal for free. Synchro Cyclone with Cloud and Tifa is another way to get really cheap heals, regen, or haste. If you have this exact party configuration, Bestial Barrage can give any limits you're saving with Red and Tifa a huge boost in power. This is the easiest phase of the whole fight because it's really just a glimpse at the final phase. Get Jenova to about a third of her health, and we have a little side trip to beat up various parts of her icky, gloopy alien body. Party configurations here always seem to be the same, so strategies are similar to usual. Spam any limits available that you don't want to save for the last phase, focus on staying safe and alive, and poke away when you can. The last phase is similar to the second one, except far more annoying and with yet another random party. I got a solid one with Yuffie and Katesith. Jenova's attacks here are chaotic and relentless, so you want to try and wreck her as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, she has a tendency to become immune to physical damage at points, making things more frustrating than they need to be, so tell her she smells like butt to lower her self-esteem stat, and then play it extra safe. You should only need one stagger here, so chip away at that until you get it, and then unleash hell. No need to rush with a party that isn't super well equipped to do so, doubly so since you never know which party members, and therefore which materia and abilities, you'll get. With Jenova done, Sephiroth is now the target. The first bit is a warm-up, normal Sephiroth with Zack by your side. Zack is overpowered, especially if you can keep Sephiroth's attention on Cloud with smart character switches. Not much to be said here. Then we have to beat up Amphibious Sephiroth's butt. Spank it hard with Cloud's sword, and this phase will feel more like a pacing beat than a real phase. Climb up to his face, and the same can be said here too. Sephiroth only does a few attacks, and all of them are really easy to avoid. Don't get greedy because that's what he's hoping for here. If you resist, you'll be moving on before you know it. This is the first phase that's actually a bit of a challenge. Tifa, Barret, and Katesith need to beat up Sephiroth's seal flippers, but to do that they have to get past Bahamut. Thankfully, this version of Bahamut is fairly weak. His attack patterns are pretty standard, and Giga Flare is really the only thing that's a major risk. If you can, beat him up before it happens. If you can't, then spam potions afterward. Once Bahamut is down, Sephiroth will start healing him with his flippers. Mow down one of them, and Bahamut will come back fairly weak. Defeat him again, and then finish off the other flipper to move on. Next is another short pacing beat fight with overpowered Zack. This is cake. Then we get to a phase that could be really difficult, except we get access to Yuffie. The goal is once again to destroy the flippers, but this time they move between elemental phases, so stand at the very back of the arena, use the corresponding elemental weakness ninjutsu, and use long-range shuriken spells to poke away at each flipper. When that's done, beat up his command materia belly, and we're moving on. Last up, we have the hardest part of the whole gauntlet, but also probably the most straightforward. With a forced party of Aerith and Cloud, it's designed to be beaten with this party, even though we're about 10 levels below expectations. It will play basically how it would have normally. ATB ward on top of a Radiant ward with Aerith, and then try to keep her there. Distract Sephiroth with Cloud and build ATB with Aerith. Whenever Sephiroth uses his Darkness Beam or Tornado attacks, try to get Aerith within range in order to unleash a couple of Sorceress Storms. This will pressure Sephiroth, allowing Cloud to do a focus thrust or two. When Aerith gets her limit, save it if you can for the final phase. Stagger him a few times while being careful to dodge his stabs and other more damaging attacks, and you'll be in the final phase before you know it. He will on occasion use Heartless Angel to bring you down to 1 HP, but if you're saving ATB like you should be, it's easy to toss 2 Giga Potions and get back in the fight, or use a multi-target heal with Aerith. The final phase is more or less timed. Sephiroth will box you in and shoot rotating double darkness beams. You'll have to fill the stagger gauge as quickly as possible before all hell breaks loose, but be wary of timing focus thrusts so that you don't get hit by the beams. This is where you'll want to use Aerith's limit break to heal if you need it. That way you don't have to waste time gaining the ATB to do it another way. Accomplishing this will stagger Sephiroth, and his HP will be so low that it's almost impossible not to defeat him from here. And with that, we've beaten Final Fantasy VII Rebirth on normal difficulty while skipping as many battles as you conceivably can. At least with the knowledge I currently have. I think the thing that's most surprising to me is that despite beating all of the post-game challenges and getting the Platinum Trophy, there was still more I could learn and more I could master in a challenge like this. After I first barely beat the Midgard Zormer on normal during testing, I thought this challenge run would be torture if it wasn't done on easy. But easy was too easy most of the time and unfulfilling. This challenge, while it does eliminate a fair amount of content from the game, does offer a difficulty level that I would quantify as hard mode for fresh files, which I think is pretty neat. In particular, I thought that only being able to access one of the 3 Magnify materia would be a challenge. You get one for free about halfway through the game, but another is hidden behind a late game side quest that requires combat, and another is in the post-game VR challenges. But instead, that limitation brought me back to the healing strategies you'd find in FF7 Remake, which was interesting. As I've mentioned a few times, similar to the no random encounters run I did of the original FF7, the biggest struggle here is really the lack of AP you get in order to level materia. This greatly limits the options afforded to you, because when you're on a late game boss, a basic fire spell isn't exactly going to do much even if they are weak to it. So how many battles were required to beat the game then? Well, based on the best I could do finding ways to avoid enemies, including bosses and the prologue and flashback stuff, but not including the boxing minigame with Dio or the Whispers fight with no HUD, you have to fight 98 battles, just under 100. If you take out the bosses, prologue, and flashback though, since bosses were never going to be assumed as avoidable, and the prologue and flashback don't impact the game at large, that number drops all the way down to just 56. So if you want to beat Final Fantasy VII Rebirth in as few normal encounters as possible, as far as I can tell, you only need to fight 56 mobs before you're done. And for me, it took about 18 hours on easy and 19 hours on normal. And just to cap everything off, mini challenge! How many Queen's Blood matches are required while playing through Final Fantasy VII Rebirth? After all, some people have complained the game comes up way too often and is way too ubiquitous. 0. The answer is 0. The only match you're even required to enter is the one against Red on the Shinrei boat, but if you just give up immediately, he wins and you're free to continue. This specific challenge, about limiting combat encounters, requires doing 3 of them in Corel Prison, but in a normal playthrough, you can skip those if you want. So if you're a Queen's Blood hater, don't play Queen's Blood. Simple. Anyway, I hope this video was enjoyable to everyone who got this far. If you try this challenge, let me know how it goes. Or if you've found a new way to skip fights I couldn't, or if you changed the rules in an interesting way. And while I can't guarantee I'll do them, if you have any ideas for game challenges you might want to see from me, drop those down in the comments too. I'm always interested in more, as long as they're fun for me, fun to watch, and something that remixes a game in a way that can be enjoyable for a wealth of people.